The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a living beast. The snowflakes, sharp and relentless, whipped across the barren landscape, burying everything in a thick, cold blanket of white. In the midst of this frozen chaos, a frail 6-year-old girl sat huddled in the corner of a small, dilapidated barn. Her small body, wrapped in a torn red sweater that had seen better days, trembled violently from the cold. Her long brown hair, matted with snow, hung in tangled strands around her pale face. Her eyes, usually bright with innocence, were now filled with deep sorrow, and small tear streaks ran down her cheeks, freezing in the bitter cold. In her hands she clutched a photograph, an old, worn-out picture of a woman with a gentle smile. It was the only connection to the life she had lost. "If I disappear, will anyone care?" she whispered, through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible above the storm. The words, soft but desperate, seemed to hang in the freezing air. She looked down at the photograph once more, tracing the outline of her mother's face with trembling fingers, trying to remember the warmth that had once surrounded her. The wind howled again, and the barn creaked, its wood strained under the pressure of the storm. Lily's fragile little frame shivered violently, the cold beginning to seep deeper into her bones. The fear of being alone, abandoned in the cold darkness, wrapped around her like an invisible chain, locking her in place. But then a sound broke through the howling wind, footsteps crunching in the snow. Lily's heart skipped a beat, her head jerking toward the door of the barn. She wasn't alone. A shadow appeared, tall and imposing against the swirling snow. Ethan Cole, a soldier in his 40s, stood at the entrance, his face weathered and tired, his camouflage uniform dusted with snow. He was carrying a large pack, and a rifle was slung across his back, but his eyes were soft as they fell on the little girl. The moment their gazes met, something in Ethan softened. He saw the small, fragile figure sitting in the corner, the sorrow in her eyes mirroring the pain he carried within his own heart. He had seen war, loss and destruction, but this was something else entirely. This was pure, unspoken fear. This was a child who had lost everything. Ethan's boots crunched softly as he approached her, the sound of his footsteps drowned by the storm, but in the quiet barn it was enough. He knelt beside her, his breath visible in the freezing air, and for a moment he simply watched her. Max, his loyal German Shepherd K9, padded up beside him, standing guard, his amber eyes filled with quiet concern. Lily looked up at Ethan through a veil of tears, her small form shaking. The soldier could see the fear and confusion in her eyes, and without a word, he slipped off his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. "It's all right," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're not alone anymore." The warmth from his coat was a small comfort, but it was enough to make Lily pause. She stared at him for a long moment, unsure of whether she could trust him. Her small, cold hands curled into fists against the coat, as if holding on to the only warmth she had left. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He had seen too much pain, too many souls lost in the darkness. But in this moment, with this little girl in front of him, something stirred within him. Something that felt like a promise. "You're safe here," he said again, more for himself than for her. But the words were true. He would protect her. He had to. He wasn't going to let her face the world alone, not like this. The storm howled louder, but inside the barn there was a fragile sense of peace. Max sat down beside them, his large body a barrier between Lily and the storm, as if promising to keep the world at bay. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Lily's gaze softened for a moment, and she spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," she whispered, the words trembling in the cold air. Ethan didn't know what to say. Instead, he gently pulled her into his arms, his hand resting on her head as Max curled up at their feet. They had no home, no safe place to go. But in this moment, in this small, quiet barn, they had something else. They had each other. And that, for now, was enough. The wind outside still howled like a wild animal, battering the barn with snow and ice. But inside, it was quieter now. Ethan sat on the cold wooden floor, his back against the barn wall, watching over Lily, who was still curled up in his coat, her small frame shivering slightly despite the warmth of the fabric. Max lay beside them, his watchful eyes never straying far from the door, the ever-vigilant protector. Lily's face was buried in the folds of Ethan's coat, and for a moment her breathing was slow and steady. The fever had begun to settle, the worst of it passing, though her fragile body still trembled from time to time. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. The weight of the promise he had silently made to protect her began to sink in. He glanced down at her, watching her sleep. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of the coat, and he could see how tired she was, emotionally and physically. Her loss, her pain, it was written all over her face. And in the few hours since they had met, she had come to trust him in a way that made Ethan's heart ache. He had never been a father, but right now, in this moment, he felt more like one than he ever had before. Max let out a low, rumbling growl, his head snapping up, ears perked, eyes sharp. Ethan immediately stilled, his hand resting lightly on his rifle, as he listened. There it was again, a faint noise in the distance, a footstep perhaps. But it was the stillness after the sound that made his gut tighten. Something wasn't right. He slowly stood up, moving silently toward the door, his boots barely making a sound in the deep snow that had drifted into the barn. Max was by his side immediately, staying low to the ground, ready to spring into action. Ethan's hand went to the door, but before he could open it, he heard a small voice behind him. "Are we safe here?" Lily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He froze, his hand on the barn door. Her voice was soft, but the question carried more weight than anything else. It wasn't just about shelter from the storm, it was about the unknown, the fear of what might come next. The world outside was harsh, unforgiving. She had lost so much, and now, here they were, trapped in a barn with no real guarantee of safety. Ethan took a breath and turned to face her. Max sat by her side, his large, comforting presence enough to calm her for the moment. "Nothing is ever completely safe," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "But as long as I'm here, I'll protect you." "I promise you," that he walked back to her and crouched down to her level, looking into her eyes. She met his gaze with a quiet trust, the kind of trust he had never expected to see from someone so young. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing on him. "You don't have to worry about being alone again, Lily." "Not while I'm here." Max let out a soft whine, and Ethan gently placed a hand on his head. The dog's presence was a reminder that they were not completely alone. They had each other. And for now, that was enough. Lily nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of fear. She didn't speak, but she crawled into Ethan's lap, wrapping her arms around him like he was the only solid thing left in her world. Ethan held her close, his hand resting gently on her back. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, slow and steady, but still fragile. The bond between them was forming, one that neither of them had expected, but that neither could deny. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the barn it felt safe, for the moment. Ethan looked out the cracked window, the light from the storm dimming as the night grew colder. The world beyond seemed impossibly far away, and in that brief moment he allowed himself to believe that they might be able to survive this. They might find peace. But in his heart he knew better. Peace was never a given. And as long as the storm raged outside, so too would the fight to protect what mattered most. The crack of a distant branch breaking in the storm brought Ethan's attention back to the present. He stood up, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders again. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. "I'm going to check the perimeter," Ethan said softly, brushing his fingers through Lily's hair one last time before standing. "Stay close, and don't go anywhere, all right?" Lily looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with quiet trust. "I'll be here," she whispered. Ethan nodded, giving her a final reassuring smile before moving toward the door. Max was already at his side, ready to follow him into the cold. He stepped outside, the storm slamming into him, the icy wind biting at his face. Max stayed close, the dog's senses sharp as they moved through the snow, scanning every shadow, every movement in the storm. Then as they rounded the corner of the barn, Ethan froze. There, just on the edge of the clearing, was a figure. A tall man, wrapped in a dark coat, his back turned as he surveyed the barn. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The man was too close, too quiet, and something about his posture, something about the way he stood, told Ethan everything he needed to know. This wasn't good. The figure outside remained still, the harsh winds of the storm whipping around him. Yet he made no move to leave. Ethan's heart pounded, his instincts screaming that this was not just another traveler caught in the storm. This man wasn't just seeking shelter. He was watching, waiting. Max stood by Ethan's side, his muscles taut, every fiber of his being alert. The dog's keen senses had picked up something Ethan couldn't quite place, and that unease settled deep in Ethan's gut. For a long moment, they simply observed the man. His back was turned, his body outlined by the snowstorm. Ethan couldn't tell whether he was armed or not, but his posture suggested he wasn't someone who would simply wander through the snow without reason. With a slow, controlled movement, Ethan motioned for Max to stay. The dog obeyed, watching the stranger intently, but staying by his side. Ethan moved cautiously toward the barn door, every step careful, deliberate. He didn't want to alert the stranger to his presence until he was certain of his intentions. As he reached the door, Ethan leaned against the frame, peering out through a small crack. The man stood, motionless, staring at the barn, as if he could sense the eyes watching him, but he made no effort to turn around. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath forming a cloud of mist in the freezing air. Was he waiting for something? Or was he sizing up the situation? Without warning, the man finally shifted, turning slightly to his right as though scanning the land around him. Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened, and he felt the cold steel against his hand. He was ready for anything. Then the man spoke, his voice cutting through the wind like a knife. "I know you're in there," he said, his tone calm, almost casual. "I've seen you and your dog." Ethan froze. The man knew. The sudden realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been spotted. Max growled softly, the low rumble vibrating in the tense silence. The man didn't seem to be threatened by the growl, though. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots crunching in the snow, and said in a louder voice, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to survive." Same as you, Ethan's mind raced. Survival was something he knew all too well. But he wasn't about to let some stranger get close to Lily, not when he wasn't sure who this man was or what he wanted. "I don't trust strangers in a storm like this," Ethan called back, his voice low and steady, though a note of tension laced through it. "Stay where you are." The stranger paused for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Ethan's eyes never left the man. "I understand," the man replied. His voice was slightly muffled by the wind, but there was no anger in it, just resignation. "I'm not asking for much, just a bit of shelter, until the storm passes." Ethan considered the words carefully. There was no malice in the man's tone, But Ethan had learned the hard way that kindness wasn't always what it seemed. He wasn't sure he could take that risk. "Not tonight," Ethan said firmly. "Find somewhere else to take shelter." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, his figure silhouetted by the storm, as if weighing his options. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. "I've got no place else to go. The storm's not letting up, and I swear I won't cause any harm. I just need a place to rest." Ethan's gaze flickered back to the barn, to where Lily was still resting inside, unaware of the potential danger just outside their door. The cold was harsh, and no one deserved to be out in the storm, but trusting a stranger like this, it didn't sit right with him. Yet, as he stood there, thinking it through, he realized that he couldn't keep hiding forever. The storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. Ethan was alone in his protective instincts. He couldn't shield Lily and Max from the world forever. He made a quick decision. Ethan stepped away from the door, his boots crunching in the snow, but he didn't open it. Instead, he spoke through the crack, his voice hard and cold. "Stay where you are. I'll give you a chance, but if you try anything—" "I won't," the stranger interrupted almost too quickly. "I promise. I just need a warm place for the night." Ethan hesitated for a moment longer before nodding to himself. He opened the door just a crack and motioned for the stranger to enter. The man hesitated, then took a cautious step forward, his face partially hidden by a scarf and the snow that had accumulated on his coat. Ethan kept his rifle in hand, watching him closely as he entered the barn. As soon as the man stepped inside, Ethan closed the door behind him, ensuring the wind wouldn't blow in further. The stranger looked around the dimly lit barn. Lily was still resting, unaware of the new arrival. Max remained close to Ethan, standing guard beside him. "I'll stay out of the way," the man said, lowering his voice. "Just don't tell the girl." "I won't bother her," Ethan nodded, still wary. "You get one night? Don't make it harder for yourself." The stranger nodded gratefully but said nothing further. As the man settled into a corner of the barn, Ethan turned his attention back to Lily, his heart still heavy with the weight of the decision he had just made. He had given this man a chance, but in the back of his mind a warning bell continued to ring. Ethan wasn't sure who this man was, but he would watch him closely. He couldn't afford to take any chances. The storm outside howled louder, the winds growing stronger. But in that barn, in the quiet corners where secrets hid in the shadows, a different kind of storm was brewing. The barn door had barely clicked shut behind the stranger when Ethan's senses sharpened. He felt an almost primal unease creeping up his spine, a warning that he couldn't shake. The man was inside, and for now there was no immediate danger. But that didn't mean the threat wasn't still there. The stranger, still dusted with snow, stood by the fire, his eyes scanning the room. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost too careful. Ethan watched him, his hand still resting on his rifle, but he didn't make a move. Max, who had been standing watch, now sat beside Ethan, his gaze never leaving the newcomer. The silence in the barn was heavy, filled only with the crackling of the fire and the distant howling of the storm. Lily lay in a quiet sleep, her breathing steady but still labored from the lingering effects of the fever. Her small, pale hand gripped the edge of Ethan's coat, but she remained unaware of the man in the barn. "Thanks for letting me in," the stranger said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it held an edge of sincerity that made Ethan's wariness rise even more. "I wasn't sure you'd be so kind." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. Max let out a soft growl at the stranger's approach, but Ethan raised a hand to calm him. "You've got one night," Ethan said slowly, his voice cold. "And don't think that means you're safe. You stay out of our way and we won't have any problems." The stranger nodded, though his face betrayed nothing. Ethan couldn't tell if the man was hiding something, but he had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially not now. The man took a seat near the fire, still cautious, but his posture relaxed slightly as though accepting Ethan's terms. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said after a moment. "My name's Lyle. I was on my own out there. Didn't have anywhere else to go." Ethan didn't speak, but his eyes flicked back to Lily. She still lay there, small and vulnerable, her face pressed into the coat, her breath coming soft and slow. Max shifted, moving closer to Ethan as if seeking reassurance from him. Ethan reached down, his hand resting on the dog's head. He needed to keep Max's trust just as much as he needed his own instincts sharp. If Max trusted this stranger, maybe Ethan could afford to do the same, but only a little. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling even louder against the barn's walls as though nature itself was warning them. Ethan glanced at the door again, his instincts telling him to keep his guard up. The storm wasn't the only thing they had to worry about now. A heavy silence settled over the barn as Lyle shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ethan before looking back at Lily. He seemed to sense the protective energy that radiated from Ethan, the fatherly warmth wrapped tightly around Lily. "She's strong," Lyle said quietly, after a long pause. "She's lucky to have you." The words hit Ethan like a punch in the stomach. His gaze darkened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Lyle. Ethan didn't want to talk about Lily like she was some kind of object of pity. She wasn't strong because of some miracle. She was strong because she had to be, because life had made her so. And Ethan wasn't here to let her down, not like everyone else had before. "You don't know her," Ethan said sharply. "And you don't need to." Lyle held up his hands in defense, clearly realizing he had crossed a line. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice calming. "I just wanted to let you know I've seen a lot of kids lose their way out there." "You're doing a good job," Ethan didn't respond, but his posture softened just slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of interaction. Lyle's words felt foreign, almost unnatural. But they also felt true, and that made Ethan uncomfortable. The storm outside continued to rage, the howling wind sounding like a war cry. Ethan could feel the pressure of it all pressing down on him, the responsibility, the duty, the constant fear of losing Lily. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. But as he glanced at Lily, something else weighed on him, something that felt heavier than the storm itself. He wasn't sure how long he could keep her safe in this world, in a world where strangers could be hiding any number of threats behind a polite smile, where survival meant trusting no one but your own instincts. The wind seemed to pause for a moment, the storm temporarily subsiding. In that quiet space, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by Lily's small, barely audible voice. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" she whispered, her face peeking out from Ethan's coat, her brown eyes still filled with fear. "I don't want to sleep alone." For a moment, Ethan was at a loss for words. He hadn't known how to give her the reassurance she needed. He hadn't known how to tell her that in this cold world, she wasn't alone, not anymore. Without thinking, Ethan leaned down and pulled her into his arms. Max shifted to make room, his warm body pressing against Lily's small form. "You're not alone," Ethan whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." "We'll be okay." Lyle sat in silence, watching them. He seemed to understand the unspoken bond that had formed between the soldier and the child. The moment stretched on, a moment of fragile peace amidst the raging storm outside. But Ethan knew that this was just the calm before the real battle, the kind of battle that didn't end with a storm passing. This was about survival, trust, and protecting the one person who had made him feel something other than the weight of war. As Lily fell asleep in his arms, her small breaths warm against his chest, Ethan stared into the fire, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. He had made his choice. He would protect her no matter what, no matter who stood in his way. The fire in the barn crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the space. Lily was now asleep in Ethan's arms, her small body curled up against him, her breath even and steady. Max lay close by, his large form curled protectively at their feet, ever watchful. Ethan's mind, however, couldn't find peace. He looked at Lily as she slept, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the only sign of life in the otherwise still barn. Her trust in him, so quickly given, was both a comfort and a burden. Ethan had promised to protect her, and every ounce of his being was devoted to that. Yet, every minute spent in this barn felt like a fragile thread, as though the world outside would tear it apart the moment they let their guard down. His eyes flickered back to the fire, the orange light dancing in the shadows. Lyle was sitting across the room, his face shadowed by the flickering flames, but his eyes were trained on Ethan. There was something about the man that made Ethan uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Ethan had made a decision to let him stay the night, but trust was earned, not given. And Ethan wasn't sure he could afford to trust anyone but Max right now. The storm outside was still raging, though not as violently as it had been earlier. The wind had lost its power, replaced with the steady patter of snow. But Ethan knew better than to think the worst had passed. The world was still cold, unforgiving, and unpredictable. As the silence stretched on, Lyle shifted in his seat. His eyes met Ethan's, his face unreadable. "Is she going to be all right?" Lyle's voice was low, almost hesitant, as though he was testing the waters. "She's been through a lot." Ethan didn't immediately respond. He shifted Lily slightly in his arms, her head resting comfortably against his chest. Max shifted closer to them, his gaze still sharp, as though he sensed the unease in the air. "I don't know," Ethan finally said, his voice rough. "But I'm not going to let anything happen to her." There was a beat of silence. Lyle didn't press further, but he seemed to understand something in Ethan's tone. The soldier's protective instinct was raw, unyielding. "I understand," Lyle said quietly, almost to himself. His gaze shifted to the floor, and for a moment, Ethan saw something flicker in his eyes. A trace of guilt, maybe? Regret? He couldn't tell, and it made him even more suspicious. The barn was quiet again, the only sound being the occasional snap of the fire. Ethan began to feel the weight of the promise he had made. He was tired, physically and emotionally. The journey to keep Lily safe had only just begun, and already the costs were mounting. The isolation, the constant vigilance, it was beginning to wear him down. Lily stirred slightly in his arms, and Ethan instinctively tightened his hold on her. Her fragile little body was a reminder of everything he had to lose. Lily wasn't just some orphan he had picked up in the storm. She was a child who had already lost too much. She needed him, and Ethan couldn't afford to fail her. As Lily settled back into sleep, her tiny form pressing closer to him, Ethan found himself lost in thought. He couldn't protect her from everything, and no matter how much he wanted to shield her from the darkness of the world, he knew that eventually the world would find its way in. Whether it was the storm outside, or the stranger sitting across the room, or something even worse, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing for certain: Lily would never face it alone. Not while he was breathing, not while Max was by their side. A low growl from Max broke the silence. Ethan's eyes shot to the door, and his hand instinctively moved to the rifle at his side. The dog's posture was rigid, his body tense and alert. Someone was coming. Someone was outside the barn, moving closer. Ethan motioned for Lyle to stay silent. He didn't trust him, but for now there was no time for questions. The barn door creaked slightly, and Ethan stepped closer to it, his rifle raised. Max stood at his side, the hair on his back standing on end. Lyle remained seated by the fire, his eyes flicking nervously between Ethan and the door. The sound outside was faint, just a whisper of movement in the snow. Ethan's heart raced as he peered through a crack in the door, eyes scanning the dark, snowy landscape. He saw nothing but the storm. Then suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and wrapped in a dark coat. The man moved toward the barn with purpose, his boots crunching in the snow, his steps measured and calm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the storm that had him on edge now. It was this man, the same stranger who had been watching them earlier. But Ethan wasn't about to wait to see what he wanted. He stepped out, Max at his side, the rifle raised and ready. "You!" Ethan called, his voice sharp, cutting through the wind. "Stop right there!" The man froze, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, they simply stood there in the snow, the storm swirling around them. Then the stranger spoke. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said again, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of warning. "But I'm not leaving without answers." Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle. "You're already a step too far." The man didn't back down. "I know what you're hiding in there." The words struck Ethan like a punch. The cold winds howled again, but it wasn't the storm that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. It was the man standing in front of him. The stranger's eyes glinted in the fading light of the storm, sharp and calculating, as if he could see through the walls of the barn and into the secrets Ethan had been keeping. "I know what you're hiding in there," the stranger repeated, his voice low, laced with a dangerous calm. He took another step forward, his boots crunching in the snow beneath him. "And I won't leave until I get the answers I'm looking for." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. Max growled softly at the stranger, his teeth visible in the pale light. The dog's stance was protective, ready to spring at the slightest provocation. "You don't know what you're talking about," Ethan snapped, keeping his voice steady. But the unease in his chest grew with each word the stranger spoke. He was no longer just an observer, he was a threat. And Ethan wasn't about to let him get any closer. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "I've seen your little companion inside," the stranger said, his eyes flicking to the barn door. "The girl. And the dog. I know exactly who you're protecting." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't say a word, but the fire in his eyes was enough to show that he wouldn't back down. "You think I'm here to hurt her?" Ethan's voice was low but filled with an unmistakable edge. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension. The stranger's smile faded, replaced by a harder, more dangerous look. "I'm here for survival. You and your dog might be able to protect her for now, but when the storm stops, when you run out of food and warmth, you won't be able to protect her from what's coming." Ethan stepped forward, his rifle raised just slightly. "You need to leave." Now the man didn't move. Instead, he looked Ethan up and down, sizing him up like he was measuring something that didn't quite fit. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, but there was a dangerous hunger there, something that made Ethan's instincts scream for him to take action. "You're too proud to let anyone else help, aren't you?" the stranger said, his tone mocking. "You think you can protect her from everything, but the truth is, you're just a soldier running out of time. You don't have the supplies to keep going. And when the storm ends, what will you do then? You won't survive alone. And neither will she." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I said, leave." For a moment the stranger stood silently, weighing his options. Max growled again, the sound low and menacing. The man's gaze shifted to the dog, and for a brief second something flickered in his eyes. A flash of fear? Number. It was something else, something Ethan couldn't quite place. "I don't want to hurt you," the stranger said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm offering a deal, soldier. The girl stays with me, and you get what you need. Warmth, food, supplies. You won't have to worry about running out of anything. You can walk away from this." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process the offer. He wasn't sure whether the stranger was bluffing or if he had something more sinister in mind. But one thing was certain, Ethan wasn't going to let Lily out of his sight, especially not to someone who had already proven they were a threat. "I don't trust you," Ethan growled, his voice low and cold. "I've made my choice. Now you get out of here." The man seemed to pause for a moment, as if considering Ethan's words. Then with a sigh, he stepped back, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that," the stranger said. His voice was calm again, but there was a hardness behind it. "But don't make me your enemy, soldier." "You'll regret it." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back toward the barn, his eyes never leaving the man. Max stayed close, watching the stranger closely. The moment felt suspended in time, the storm outside the only sound filling the air, the wind howling louder in protest. The stranger didn't move further. Instead, he gave Ethan one last look, something like respect in his gaze, though it was tinged with annoyance. "I'll be watching," the man said. "The storm will pass. But so will your chance." With that, he turned and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving Ethan standing at the entrance, his rifle still raised. For a moment, Ethan stood there, listening to the storm outside. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. The man's words rang in his ears. "You won't survive alone." But Ethan wasn't about to let anyone threaten Lily. She was everything to him now, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Inside the barn, Lily stirred, but she remained asleep, unaware of the tension that had just unfolded at the door. Max stood beside Ethan, his eyes trained on the storm, ever alert. "Stay close, boy," Ethan murmured to the dog, his eyes scanning the storm outside. "We've got more to protect than just ourselves now." He turned and walked back to Lily, carefully lifting her from the ground and cradling her in his arms. The fire's warmth was a welcome comfort after the chill outside, and for a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they were safe. But Ethan knew better than to believe that. He had to stay vigilant. The storm wasn't the only thing they had to survive. Here's part 7 of your story, continuing from part 6. Part 7, A Flicker of Hope. The storm outside raged on, but inside the barn a fragile calm settled over Ethan, Lily, and Max. The flickering fire provided warmth, its crackling sounds filling the silence, while Lily slept soundly, nestled in Ethan's arms. Her fever had finally broken, and though she was still pale and weak, her breathing had steadied. The worst of it seemed to be behind them, but Ethan couldn't shake the unease that lingered. Lyles. Words echoed in his mind. "You won't survive alone." It had been hours since the stranger had left, but the tension still hung in the air. Ethan had been through countless battles, both physical and emotional, but this was different. This was something he couldn't fight with just his hands or a weapon. This was about Lily and about keeping the promise he'd made to protect her. As Ethan sat there, watching over Lily, he felt the weight of that promise more than ever. He hadn't expected to find someone like Lily, someone who had lost everything but was still fighting to survive. And he hadn't expected to find himself in this position, protecting a child in the middle of a storm, with danger lurking on every side. The fire crackled again, and Max stirred at Ethan's feet, his ears flicking as if sensing something in the distance. Ethan stiffened, his hand automatically moving to the rifle at his side. His eyes darted to the door, but the storm outside was too thick to see anything clearly. The faint sound of footsteps, muffled by the howling wind, broke the silence. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there. Max stood up, his body tense and alert, and Ethan quickly rose to his feet, moving silently toward the door. His eyes flickered to Lily, still asleep on the makeshift bed near the fire, Her face relaxed for the first time in days. He couldn't let anyone near her, not after what happened earlier. He crouched low, slowly making his way toward the door. He paused, waiting for any sign of movement from outside, his eyes narrowing against the blinding snow. The footsteps grew louder, and a figure emerged from the swirling storm. It was Lyle. Ethan. His hand instinctively tightened around the rifle as he stepped forward, but Lyle held up his hands in a gesture of peace. His expression was calm, but there was something almost resigned in his eyes, something Ethan couldn't quite place. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Lyle said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. He took a step closer, but Ethan didn't lower the rifle. "I need to talk to you." Ethan. His instinct screamed for him to turn the man away, but something in Lyle's demeanor made Ethan hesitate. The man wasn't approaching aggressively. Instead, he seemed almost defeated, as if he was searching for something, an answer perhaps. "I'm listening," Ethan said, his voice cold and guarded. Lyle nodded, lowering his hands. "I know you don't trust me. And you have every right not to, but I've been out there, alone, and I've seen what this world does to people, how it breaks them. I just wanted to check on you both, make sure you're okay." Ethan didn't move, still keeping his distance. He wasn't fooled by the stranger's sudden shift in demeanor. If anything, it made Ethan more suspicious. He'd seen too many men like Lyle, men who acted kind only to hide their true intentions. "I told you," Ethan said firmly, "you're not welcome here. Go back to wherever you came from." Lyle nodded, but his eyes weren't filled with malice. They were filled with something else, something that Ethan couldn't quite name. "I understand. I'll leave, but know this. I'm not offering help because I want something in return. I'm offering it because I know what it's like to lose everything." The wind picked up, swirling around them, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Ethan kept the rifle aimed, but the tension between them had shifted. Lyle wasn't the threat that Ethan had once believed. Finally, Lyle spoke again, his voice softer. "I've seen things that no one should see. I know what it's like to live in the aftermath, to be haunted by the things we've lost. But you don't have to do this alone." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his suspicion not easing, but something in Lyle's words struck a chord. Ethan had been alone before, but now he had Lily. He couldn't afford to let anyone jeopardize that bond. "Leave," Ethan said again, his voice firm. "We're not alone." "Not anymore." Lyle looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the storm. His steps were slow, almost defeated, and Ethan watched him disappear into the swirling snow, a cold gust of wind chasing him away. As Ethan closed the door, he leaned against it for a moment, his heart still racing. His grip tightened around the rifle in his hands, but it was no longer about the stranger outside. It was about Lily, who was sleeping peacefully just a few feet away. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not when the world outside still threatened everything he had left. Max let out a low growl from beside him, and Ethan looked down at the dog. The storm wasn't over. There would always be more threats, but as long as Ethan had Lily and Max, he would keep fighting. He would protect them. He took one last look at Lily, then sat down beside her, gently brushing her hair from her forehead. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Ethan watched over her, his heart filled with a fierce resolve. The storm outside raged, but Ethan had made his choice. He would never let her face the world alone again. The storm outside had not relented, but within the walls of the barn there was a fragile stillness. The fire crackled, casting soft shadows on the wooden beams above. Ethan sat on the cold floor, his back against the wall, watching Lily sleep. Her fever had finally broken, and though she was still weak, the worst was behind them. But Ethan knew the battle wasn't over. The storm was only the beginning. Max sat beside him, his body a reassuring presence, his eyes trained on the door, ever watchful. The dog had become more than just a companion. He was a protector, a link to the world Ethan had once known. Together, the three of them formed a bond that was stronger than any storm. The barn was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the fire. Lily shifted in her sleep, her small body curled under the thick blanket Ethan had wrapped around her. Her breathing was steady, her face calm, though the marks of her ordeal still clung to her. Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had made it through countless battles, but none of them had ever been like this. Lily wasn't just a mission, she wasn't just someone to be protected. She had become his family, and that bond was something deeper than anything he'd ever known. He glanced at Max, who shifted slightly, sensing Ethan's unease. The dog's golden eyes met his, as though silently offering reassurance. Ethan smiled faintly, grateful for the dog's presence. The storm outside still howled, but within this small, makeshift refuge there was a strange peace. Ethan wasn't sure how long they could stay here, or if the stranger would return, but for now they were safe. And that was enough. Lily stirred again, and Ethan gently brushed the hair from her forehead, his hand lingering on her soft skin. She shifted in her sleep, her small hand reaching for his as if seeking comfort. Ethan took her hand in his heart swelling with emotion. "Lily," he whispered softly, almost to himself. "I promise. I'll never let you go." The words felt like a vow, one that echoed in the stillness of the barn. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that Lily would not face it alone. He would protect her, no matter what. Max let out a soft sigh, then stood up, walking to the door. Ethan followed the dog's movements, his senses on high alert. There was something about Max's behavior that told him the danger wasn't over. As Ethan moved closer to the door, he heard a faint sound outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. Not the familiar, heavy footsteps of a stranger, but something lighter, more familiar. Then a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the storm. Ethan instinctively reached for his rifle, but when the figure stepped into the barn, he relaxed. It was Lyle. The stranger didn't move forward, standing just inside the threshold, his eyes scanning the room. He was no longer carrying the edge of hostility that Ethan had felt earlier. His posture was different now, less confrontational, more resigned. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Lyle said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. I thought you might need help." Ethan stood still, his hand still on his rifle. He wasn't ready to trust Lyle, not after everything that had happened. But the man didn't seem like the same person who had approached them before. There was a weariness in his eyes now, something that softened his previously harsh demeanor. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice low and wary. He had no intention of letting his guard down. "I came to apologize," Lyle said, his tone sincere but quiet. "For what I said earlier. I didn't mean to threaten you, I was just desperate. The storm, the cold, it's hard to think clearly when you've been out there for so long." Ethan studied him carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly. He couldn't let his guard down just yet. "And what makes you think I'll trust you now?" Ethan asked, his voice still firm. The fire crackled softly in the background, the warmth a sharp contrast to the cold unease that still lingered between them. Lyle hesitated for a moment before stepping inside the barn, his eyes flicking to Lily and then back to Ethan. "I know you don't trust me, but I want to make things right. I don't have much to offer, but I've got food and supplies. You don't have to do this alone." Ethan's eyes flickered to Lily, who was still asleep, and then to Max, who was standing watch, as always. The storm outside wasn't going to let up anytime soon, and Ethan knew they couldn't survive on nothing. Supplies were running low, and they would need more than just warmth to get through the coming days. But trusting Lyle was another matter. "Why?" Ethan asked, still suspicious. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" Lyle stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I lost my family too. A long time ago. I know what it's like to be alone. I don't want anyone else to go through that." For the first time, Ethan saw the man for what he was, someone who had been through hell and had emerged on the other side, scarred and broken. Ethan understood that more than anyone. "All right," Ethan said, his voice softer now, though still cautious. "You can stay. But no more talk about the girl. She's under my protection, understand?" Lyle nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Understood." The storm outside seemed to lose some of its force as the night wore on, the wind settling into a quieter rhythm. Ethan took a breath, allowing himself to relax, just slightly. The tension of the last few days hadn't vanished, but for the first time in a long while it felt like they had a chance. Ethan sat down beside Lily, his hand gently brushing her hair, as he looked at the fire. Max sat at his feet, ever watchful, and Lyle stayed near the entrance, keeping to himself. In that moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. Together. The world outside was still cold, and the storm wasn't over. But inside this barn, in this fragile space of warmth and safety, Ethan had found something worth fighting for. He had found family.